Chris, what we've been looking at 100 kilometres away from where you are is in stark contrast to what's happening around you. Last time we spoke, dozens of people had been killed. Could you bring us up to speed on the latest, please?
That's right, Tom. Yeah, so we're at the Malacca protest site, which is just a few hundred metres from the barrier fence with Israel. We've been here throughout the day. The crowds now do seem to be leaving, but it's been a day of chaos and carnage really here, starting pretty early on. What you've seen is kind of various levels of protesters, those who will stand and observe from afar, and then right down at the front near the barbed wire fence which separates us from Israel, you see what at times was hundreds of mainly young men getting very close to the border fence, and that's when the Israelis tend to open fire. The last death toll we had shows that this has been bloodier pretty much on its own than the vast majority of what's gone before during 6 weeks of protests. I was talking about those 6 weeks of protests. There was a call for a big turnout today as the US embassy has moved Jerusalem and ahead of Nakba Day tomorrow. Hamas, which runs the Gaza Strip, also saying that it wouldn't oppose people seeking to breach the fence. And well, the toll speaks for itself, really, in terms of the number of casualties today and the way the Israelis have responded.
And the day began with an airdrop of leaflets by the Israeli authorities warning people not to approach the fence and warning them of the consequences of doing so. And I'm just wondering, from speaking to people there, what sort of impression are you getting from what people are telling you? Is there a sense of hopelessness that there is really very little scope at this particular stage, very difficult to envisage anything resembling a peace process coming back to life anytime soon, Chris?
That's right, yes. Well, as I said, there's been 6 weeks of demonstrations. They were over the right to return for Palestinian refugees forced from their land with the state of the creation of Israel. But throughout that series of protests, and indeed today, a series of underlying and new issues have re-emerged. There's the issue of statehood, of course. Now we have the issue of the US Embassy moving to Jerusalem, and there's the issue of the ongoing blockade of Gaza, something which people here are desperate for relief from. Obviously, freedom of movement is a huge issue, but it's also the effects that it has on people's everyday lives, on the unemployment rate here, on the lack of electricity and water, etc. And that's why when you speak to particularly some of the young protesters who are prepared to go and risk their lives in front of Israeli gunfire, there is, as you said, that sense of desperation there. They've been protesting often. There are many more people here than were, for example, on last Friday's protest. Many people we've been speaking to in Gaza, not necessarily attending all of those, but saying that the protests that are planned today and tomorrow, in terms of the significance of the issues, they were absolutely determined to come along. It's not just a picture of what happens right up by the border fence, the violence that happens up at the border fence. There have been many thousands more Palestinians here today.
Okay, so a sense of hopelessness, a sense of despair and anger. And I'm just wondering if you get the impression that all of that anger is directed at Israel, or whether some of that anger is directed at the Palestinian leadership, in particular there in Gaza at Hamas.
Well, I was talking about about the conditions within Gaza. They are obviously, for the most part, despite the blockade, etc., despite the violence on the border, they are everyday issues. The blockade is obviously part of it, but as you say, there is frustration from people directed towards what is an ongoing rivalry between the two main factions, Fatah and Hamas, who, as you say, are in control here in Gaza. There have been numerous reconciliation efforts over the years, but people here really feel that in terms of the situation on the ground, things aren't moving forward, although obviously their key gripes are with the Israelis, and the anger today very much directed towards the other side of the border.